good morning or evening or night, as the case might be. When we were thinking about what we thought the future of visualization and storytelling would be, it reminded us of an old story, uh, one that probably a lot of us have heard or seen growing up. And that's the story about the five blind men who chanced upon an elephant in the forest. And of course, since they didn't get the big picture, each one of them visualized that elephant completely different. And their descriptions ranged from a rope to a spear to a rope once again. Looking back at that story, because all learning comes from embedding successful learning from your past and present into the future. So if you redux that story today, probably organizations are structured more like the spear and the rope than they are of elephant. And most clients and most organizations believe quite strongly in specialization of skill sets. And the logical question to ask, therefore, is that if we're telling the story for somebody who's in charge of spear, then shouldn't we be giving a spear story to them and a tree story to them or a rope story to them? And so, isn't that the logical thing to do anyway? Aren't we intuitively hardwired to tell stories? Yes, this is not a skill set that we have to necessarily acquire because it's pretty much hardwired into our DNA. In fact, if you look at, there are many things that are said about storytelling, but the two that we've put on this slide, we love particularly because they point us in the direction of not just that it is fun to tell stories, not that it's just entertaining or visually rich to tell stories. It is essentially the most fundamental way of communicating, right from our ancient epics and all traditions of storytelling, which actually began verbally and were passed down to generations in a sort of speaking way before it became a visual sort of a way. So storytelling is not just because it's gimmicky and it's fun to do and it's attention grabbing, but storytelling is actually the most fundamental way of connecting and creating. So don't we tell stories already today? Are we saying that stories are not available to us today? Have all of us on this call not worked very hard to actually be greater narrators of stories more visually, more powerfully than before? Of course we have. And we're working on visualizing and creating compelling stories on insights and information and data today as well. No question about that. But if we deeply examine the paradigm of storytelling today, we'd find that stories are being told, but they're primarily told from the viewpoint of one person, the person who's actually telling the story, the narrator, the storyteller. And that's where we think the future should diverge differently. Because at the end of the day, whose story is it anyway? Very often in our experience, we take one piece of research information or insight information or compelling facts that we've put together, and we try and rejig the same thing for different audiences who are going to receive it. The simplest way to do that is, of course, one size fits all and hope that a diverse audience will pick out what they want from it. Or we strategically use the hide function rather efficiently, or the highlight function a little better, and then sort of, adjust the story to who we are telling the story to. And yet we need to recognize that the people who are receiving these stories are completely different stakeholders. They're going to be looking at the same issue and challenge quite differently because they are in different roles. And more importantly, they're going to make different decisions on the back of what we are telling them. So rather than buffet, we feel that we have to go to fine dining. And that really means that the lens needs to be from the recipient's perspective, not the narrator's perspective when you tell a story. And so, well, reflection, yes, refraction, even more. The same story does not resonate with every audience. The same story does not help every individual equally. And therefore, when we look at the future of storytelling, we really are looking at landing separate stories for individual audiences, keeping in mind their roles, their remits, their decision-making ability, what they are actually going to be landing on the back of this, their function, and so on and so forth. After all, at the end of the day, any piece of information, data, and insight that we communicate, what are we essentially trying to do? We're seeking connection, and we're seeking internalization for decision-making, not just for debriefing somebody. So what would we do differently from today? What should the future of storytelling and visualization be over and above, incremental to what we're doing? It could be incremental, or it could be extremely direction changing, as the case might be. But we believe there are three things, at least, that are immediately obvious about what we would need to do differently. First, the story is above and beyond the methodology and framework we use to deliver it. So story lies away from that and further from that and above that, and it's kind of a superstructure, and it is not subsumed completely by the methodologies and framework that we therefore use to access that story. Secondly, squarely, the focus is lying on the story itself. We showcase the story more than we showcase anything else. And finally, it's about opening up our inner creative eye and to look at the rich repository of different stories that lie in the same mother lode. It's not that difficult, and it is not that new either. If you look at all creative inspiration sources, whether that's storytellers or books, you would find that, of course, this has been attempted more successfully than some people than others. Our first example comes from a beautiful little compilation which we recommend everyone reads, called 12 Red Herrings by Jeffrey Archer, who's known for many other books as well. And it's a brilliant little short story format that narrates a base common story. It's about a man who aspires a beautiful woman waiting at a theater with an extra ticket, and she's waiting for her companion to show up. That's a familiar story for quite a few people. And he's, of course, irresistibly drawn to her, and he immediately resolves to get to her one way or the other. He actually manages to wangle that ticket, find a place next to her, get started talking, and then even manages to land a meal date. From that point onward, that story is delivered with 4 different endings, very evocatively titled Rare, Burnt, Overdone, and Au Point. Each of those stories actually takes a completely different leap. One plays true to type and delivers on his romantic ending, exactly the way he visualized it. The second story goes off onto a comedy of errors and mixed identities, and yet another is a fairly interesting reversal of events. So can we, therefore, learning from this, begin to anticipate alternative stories from our story, from our data for the audience? Looking at cinema now, well, we've seen a lot of movies which we know have been shot with different endings, and depending on whether the box office figures support or do not support the ending, filmmakers have been known to alter the ending. We're not talking about that, but actually talking about a fairly iconic movie called Clue, which was released in 1985. And interestingly, the story goes that Clue was quite a commercial disaster at the time it was released, and that was perhaps because it was ahead of its time. But today, it has gone into the legends and is something of an icon for creative thinking, which people appreciate it for. Clue was actually released with 3 different endings in different theaters, which meant that Clue ended differently for you, depending on which theater you happened to be in. So it, at the fundamental level, follows the same pattern of a murder mystery. It has a group of guests, it has a murder, it has several suspects, some red herrings, and further revelations. Clue has been worked into a fairly successful board game. The fact that it delivers different endings from the very same piece of data is exactly what we're talking about as the satisfaction of a human need to see different solutions and different endings to the same set of facts, which gives a unique connect, a unique experience and customization for the person who's receiving that.
So what does this mean for us? I think the first thing, point, and I think the key point that we're making is that storytelling is not the same as visuals. and we very often confuse the two. I mean, typically in our industry, we'd have our data on and then we bung in a few visuals. That's not storytelling. I think the main thing for us to recognize is that a good story speaks for itself. It actually needs fewer props, and in some cases may not need visuals at all. So for example, if you take a lot of the epics, the Iliad, the Odyssey, the Mahabharata, the Ramayana, they've stood the test of time. The visuals actually came in, it was an oral tradition. These were stories that were told orally with the visuals coming in much later. And I think therefore, for us, for a lot of our presentations and reports, we need to remind ourselves that visuals are meant, when you're using them to illustrate the story, they are not necessarily the story. Of course, you could also have a completely visual story, as we have shown here, where sometimes, I mean, if you look at this, sometimes a good story needs no words. So I think the key that we have to, and the central point is that you need to focus on the story. I think therefore, as practitioners, it's important for us to recognize and acknowledge the difference between the stories we're telling and the visualizations of the story if we want to change. And we thought this quote from Michael Margolis summed it up very well. Which is, the stories we tell literally make the world. If you want to change the world, you need to change your story. This truth applies to individuals and institutions. And therefore, taking that into our context, if you are talking to different individuals, even within the same institution, why would you not change your story? So where do we go from here? According to us, this story can also have different endings. So we've got three possible endings for you. The first, and that's the one we truly love, is that as practitioners, if you're making a presentation or a report, you do multiple and different presentations based on the same data for the same project. From a practitioner's point of view, or clients are delighted. Who won't like it if you customized and gave them a story that was completely relevant for them? And of course, if you happen to be the practitioner on the agency side, it's delightful, and the clients pay for every individual presentation that you make, and we all live happily ever after. The second scenario, and I think here we need to take a reality check, is that yes, we make multiple and different presentations based on the same data for the same project. Of course, clients are happy, as we said earlier, who won't be? But, well, it is the same project, so they're going to pay for one project, one presentation. You put in the effort, it's your time, your money. And scenario 3, which is probably like the burnt ending in One Man's Meat, is, well, we don't change. We continue to use the same one hat fits all, and then we make the same presentation fit every audience with our little tweaks, hiding slides, creative highlighting, etc. Clients and practitioners both just continue like this, but at the end of the day, nobody is actually very happy at the end of the day. There's a big sense of dissatisfaction on both sides. So if we want a happy ending, what do we need to do? I think when you're looking at it and saying, okay, there are two broad stakeholders in this. There's the practitioner and the client, as we're calling them. Both sides need confidence and they need to coordinate with each other very closely. I think from practitioners' points of view, we need to understand different audiences better in advance. We need to understand the roles, the remits, what are the kind of decisions they make within the organization. we need to rewrite presentations for different stakeholders rather than trying to make do with the one presentation that we have. From a client's point of view, they need, I think as clients, we need to invest time in helping our partners understand the different stakeholders. It's important. I mean, we also need to invest the time in organizing multiple presentations for smaller, more cohesive audiences. Yes, it is much harder work, but then at the end of the day, where there's no pain, there's no gain. We believe that it is important for us as insights professionals to help our clients to a happy ending. We believe that we need to take the initiative and change our individual stories and stories for organizations. As we said earlier, we know it's not going to be easy, but as a community of insights professionals, we need to decide what kind of stories we want to tell and what kind of endings we believe in. We believe in happy endings. What's your story?
Thank you, Asha and Rupa. So I've got a question from one of our Newmar regulars, and they say, after you deliver a story, would the client ask you to support your findings by providing them hard data or not? Would they want to try to reuse and disentangle the data themselves?
I think as practitioners and as insights professionals, we tell stories based on data. So I think when we are talking of stories, we need to remember that they are data-based stories. I think how you put it forward and put it forth is up to you.
So I think that's a great question. I think it also talks to the level of confidence and relationship that you enjoy with the client. And we found that for the better part, clients come to insight practitioners as experts, and they are singularly reassured that we have visited all of the facts and the data is very much there. I think it's our choice as to whether we pitch what we tell on the story, and the data in our mind is appended to that. Of course, all of the evidence is available. But if there is a trial of fire every time we tell a story to say where did that story come from, I think it points to the relationship and confidence building as consulting on the consumer side that industry must see us as, rather than invincible fact tellers, which I think we are in any case.
That's great, thank you. I'm wondering whether anybody in the audience thinks towards the end of your presentation when you were talking about liking having a happy ending, whether that's a controversial thing to talk about. Because sometimes researchers do have to deliver bad news. Now, that doesn't mean that the story can't have a happy ending. How much do you, or how do you work in, the research objectives of your project, what your findings are, what's good for the client to hear, what's the true and, faithful story that you can tell from the data? How do you balance off all of those different, kind of competing demands?
I think when we are saying happy endings, we don't necessarily mean that everybody leaves the room with a smile on their face. I think it's about not saying I will tell you what you want to hear, but I think it is what you need to hear, given what are the kind of decisions that you make. I think a happy ending in our context is if you have nailed the brief.
I think in our experience, clients are capable of taking the most devastating back to the board kind of news if you have grounded it in a lot of storytelling and so what and why is this important to know. So if you stick your neck out and become part of the inner circle in telling that story, because you could very well slip back into these are the facts and I will lead you to deal with these. But to be part of an ending means that you push yourself from the point of view and concern for the business. Apart from which, of course, I think it also requires you to perhaps interact with the client even before the presentation for you to actually be able to share that these are the kinds of things, so that it's not a nasty little surprise that you're delivering at their door. People are happy with both happy news and even when they are not happy, I think they receive the truth and honest fact quite well if you show your intent and if you really participate in it as opposed to you just deliver and leave.
Thank you. And then when we go back to the idea of constructing individual stories, and how do you check for reference points? And the question that's come through on Twitter is, meat's good for some, sports, good for others and not good for others. Drinking beer is a good metaphor for some people and not for others. How do you kind of tap into what are the right reference points for your, individual people or individual groups that you're telling the story to?
True. I think that's again a great question, and I think we will not quick fix that by saying that, oh, we know that all the time, or there's some magic formula behind that. In our experience, what helps is, one, storytelling is also collaborative art. And it's collaborations between researchers. It is also, I think if we're telling better stories now than we did earlier, it's also because we are working on those stories with clients. So the facts might be your job, but the storytelling is always collaborative. And then, of course, there is experience with the category, comfort with the category, or some creative abilities that individuals hold. But for the better part, the choice of the metaphor could be creative, but the choice of the story in terms of what you want to land is certainly something that does better with collaboration with clients.
Some of the metaphors come with, of course, the kind of relationship you have with your client. You may not know that in advance before walking into the room. You can't know everyone personally. But I think it's also about being a little nimble. You can pick up cues. You can see the kind of examples, metaphors, etc. that are being used as you go along to register. So, and I'm sure many of us have done it over the years, and you find somebody's talking a lot of football or something, when they were trying to make sense of a previous point. I mean, you automatically kind of move, and when you're talking about a point later in the presentation, perhaps you bring it in, assuming you know enough about football to talk about.
So we'll always angle it to the culture, but we know some of them absolutely rock it everywhere. So Asha and I will go back to Bollywood every day of the week. That works, whichever audience.
In India.
Excellent. Well, we're out of time. So thank you both very much for coming along and presenting and answering the audience questions.
Thank you.
Thank you.